By late winter of 1864, a thin wire humming across the continent carried a message that would change the war. Ulysses S. Grant, broad-shouldered, quiet, habitually modest in conversation and ruthless in arithmetic, received a telegram whose few spare lines contained something close to a revolution. President Abraham Lincoln had decided that the Union armies needed a single will, not a committee of plans. Henry Halleck, the exacting administrator who could shuffle papers and soothe quarrels but could not make an army move like a single creature, would be moved aside into the safer harbor of Chief of Staff. Grant would become General-in-Chief, promoted to Lieutenant General, the first American to hold that rank since George Washington. The Republic had gone back to its founding shelf to retrieve an old instrument and placed it in the hands of a man who did not dazzle in salons and did not need to. Grant had been trapped, in a way, by his own success. His military division of the Mississippi cleaned like a battlefield swept of spent cartridges. Between Kansas and the Appalachians, there was little left to conquer with decisive effect. Mobile, Alabama, a vexing node in Confederate logistics, remained, but the Navy and Nathaniel Banks had first claim on it. The Army of Tennessee had slipped from his reach toward Atlanta, and Grant, who had once been scolded for leaving his official district, was reluctant to wander again without a mandate written in iron. Now the mandate had arrived, and with it a change in temperature. The war, always a grindstone, would begin to turn faster. He came to Washington in early March, March 8 by the city's calendar, a date later recalled with the clarity that attaches itself to new appointments and old photographs. The capital saw again its pageant of uniforms and mud and anxious clerks, but something had shifted.
Hold the line,
Grant accepted his promotion on a condition that turned the air in the room taut. He would inform the President and the Secretary of War of his movements and consult on overall strategy, but once the guns were talking, they would keep their hands off the reins. Lincoln, having learned painfully from earlier seasons of hesitation and interference, agreed with alacrity. Edwin Stanton's eyes, wary and exacting, did not soften as quickly. He worried, as men in his office must, about politics and the price of battlefield initiative charged against an election year. But even Stanton recognized that the arithmetic of caution had run out. Grant's logic was uncluttered and, to some, cold. He was not after capitals, not primarily, and not after banners or balustrades. He wanted the armies, the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of Tennessee, the two vertebrae that held up the Confederacy. Crush those bones and the body would not stand. The Confederate government, in his eyes, mattered as much as the oxygen that fills a room but cannot defend its door. An army, once broken, carried away the will of the state with it. This was not romance. It was physics. On paper it looked as if someone had finally arranged the scattered chessmen by color and direction. Union forces would press in a schedulable rhythm, not with the old staggering of separate campaigns, but with a simultaneity that robbed the enemy of rescue. An opponent could survive one house being set on fire if he could dash into the alley and bring water from the next, but he could not save 3 homes at once. Grant intended to make the Confederacy choose which blaze to watch and which to let consume the street. He would not afford Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee the luxury of a single crisis at a time. If the Confederacy answered one punch, it would be too late for the next. If it backed away from 2, the third would find empty space in which to drive. What made this strategy feel new was not its theory, which McClellan had once sketched with confidence and then failed to animate, but the promise of execution. Grant had coordinated far-flung armies at Chattanooga with a steadiness that put bridges under feet and orders into practice. He was not a writer of grand designs that petered out on muddy roads. He made roads and pushed men down them. He could also see what the veterans in the ranks felt like at dawn after nights of rain. His genius was not merely for maps but for the friction that makes maps lie. Around him, Washington's soundscape kept its usual contrasts: wagon wheels on Pennsylvania Avenue, the ringing of smiths shoeing horses, the muffled talk of cabinet rooms in which men tried to measure the future against the weight of the present. Newspapers had begun to chew on the bones of every failure and panic at the blood price of every victory. Lincoln's re-election, a horizon suddenly close, rose and fell in those headlines like a tide. Grant, who did not enjoy sentences as much as he tolerated them, had to think about that too, if only to set it aside. He warned that the fight would be severe, that the war he had in mind was not a dash toward a picturesque triumph but a long door closed and pushed against. He asked, in his way, to be left alone with the work. In the corridors, officers read the omens like weather. George Meade, who had borne the Army of the Potomac from Gettysburg through dreary months, had half expected to be relieved, and some of the old Army gossip said he should be.
Boys, we can do this.
Yet Grant, whose instincts fused ruthlessness with a quiet respect for competence, retained him. He would bolt his headquarters to Meade's, directing the larger movements, while Meade handled the day's clawing fights and the intricate domesticity of an army: rations, routes, the endless fit of corps and divisions. Grant's orders would be simple and relentless: wherever Lee goes, you will also go. There was mercy in the clarity, and terror too. To hear the soldiers tell it later, the change felt like an arrow suddenly pointed instead of a compass shrugged. They had marched so many circles around Virginia that the roads themselves seemed tired.
Forward, men, forward!
Now there was talk of movement not toward a line to be held but toward an enemy to be taken. Men like Gouverneur K. Warren, careful, mathematically inclined, tried to add this new speed to their own calculus. If they chased Lee into the green labyrinth west of Fredericksburg, the wilderness, would not the trees themselves rise up, as they had at Chancellorsville, to confuse and fragment them? Others, long used to rail supply lines that could be shredded by Stuart's cavalry, wondered how Grant meant to feed an army he intended to drive fast. River logistics, came the answer, and the readiness to plan 2 days beyond the visible horizon. Grant did not promise the impossible. He acknowledged that the wilderness could not be avoided. They would have to pass through it, as men pass through a dangerous neighborhood, quickly, heads low, weapons ready, before the resident genius of the place understood who had come. If Lee refused the straight battle Grant wanted, if he would not be drawn to a clean, destroying engagement, then Grant would do something that had often eluded his predecessors: he would not stop. The campaign would not reset after a bad day. It would, like a river, keep going. What the public could not see, though they felt its outline in rumors and maps in the papers, was the deeper wager that Grant had made with time and numbers. The Union could replace losses that the Confederacy could not. This truth did not flatter the North, nor did it excuse sloppy generalship. It simply described a reality that Grant intended to lean on until it groaned. The Confederates had courage in a kind of abundance that made poets lose their balance. What they lacked was iron and men, enough of both, for long enough. Grant was neither contemptuous of their valor nor overawed by it. He had a ledger in his head, and he meant to zero it out. So, in the first days of March, the capital received a general who disliked spectacle and a strategy that depended on endurance more than brilliance. It felt, to those watching, like the war had acquired a metronome. Soon the roads would dry. Soon the Rapidan would be crossed. Soon the green corridors would swallow flags and bugle calls, and the fires would light and the telegraph keys would chatter with casualty lists that made mothers sit down on kitchen floors, letters falling from their hands. But for the moment, in the quiet after the telegram and before the movement of 120,000 men, there was the calm taste of an intention spoken plainly: destroy the armies, end the war. The rest, Grant believed, would follow. George Gordon Meade sat in his headquarters in early spring, bracing himself for dismissal. He had won at Gettysburg, yet somehow seemed to lose ground with every month that followed. Victories were never clean, defeats lingered in memory, and Washington was a place that loved to measure reputations by gossip as much as by reports. Meade expected that when Grant arrived with his new authority, he would bring his own general to lead the Army of the Potomac. Instead, Grant surprised him. There would be no change of command, at least not in name. Meade would remain, a tacit acknowledgement that the army did not need more disruption. What it needed was clarity. The solution Grant devised was unorthodox but practical. He would not attempt to sit in Washington and pull strings like a distant puppeteer. Nor would he push Meade aside and risk a rebellion of pride among senior officers. Instead, he physically attached his own headquarters to Meade's, riding with the army and directing its broad movements while leaving tactical command and administration in Meade's hands. This arrangement allowed Meade to continue issuing orders in his own name, while every major decision pulsed outward from Grant's strategy. It was a subtle shift that soldiers could feel even if they did not see the paperwork. The army suddenly moved with a different rhythm, like an orchestra that had kept its conductor but adopted a sterner composer. Grant respected Meade's talents, but he also respected the weight of responsibility. He told him plainly, "Wherever Lee goes, you will also go." There would be no more sitting idle behind rivers waiting for better conditions, no more seasonal resets. The campaign would continue regardless of outcome, like the tide pressing against a shore until it broke through. This relentless pursuit required reorganization at every level, because the Army of the Potomac in early 1864 was a veteran force in name only. Attrition had thinned its ranks, most regiments were shadows of their former selves, and many of those who remained would muster out by September when their enlistments expired. Grant and Meade set to work consolidating these skeletal units. Regiments that once carried their own banners and histories were fused together, their survivors sharing tents and stories of battles fought under different commanders. Pride often suffered in the process. Men hated to see their flags furled away, but necessity demanded it. 3 infantry corps and 1 cavalry corps became the backbone of the new structure. Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps, still substantial in number, would march alongside them, but outside Meade's direct command. This was a compromise, one of many required to balance egos and efficiency. The problem of supply hung over every conversation. The Orange and Alexandria Railroad, long the artery feeding federal movements, was dangerously exposed to Jeb Stuart's cavalry raids. At Chancellorsville, the same logistical fragility had doomed Hooker's army. Grant refused to be held hostage by that weakness. Instead, he announced that the campaign would rely on river logistics whenever possible, building depots along navigable waters, hauling supplies by barge and gunboat rather than risking fragile rails. It was a gamble, but one that matched his determination to move south aggressively. If the rivers could float his army, then they would march through forests and over poor roads without fear of starvation. Grant also looked with a cold eye at the heavy artillery regiments stationed around Washington. These units, drilled for garrison duty, had spent much of the war polishing cannons and saluting dignitaries. Now they were stripped of their ceremonial comfort and converted into infantry. The men, unused to long marches and musket drills, grumbled as they left the safety of earthworks and entered the harsh fraternity of the field army. Some called them bandbox soldiers, but in the months ahead they would bleed as fiercely as any veteran. Timing was another silent enemy. With so many enlistments due to expire in midsummer, Grant and Meade agreed that the campaign had to strike before July. Every week lost meant brigades evaporating, companies dissolving, and experience flowing back into the towns and farms of the north. If they delayed too long, they would find themselves leading an army of recruits against Lee's battle-hardened veterans, a reversal too dangerous to risk. The plan, therefore, was to begin as soon as the Virginia roads dried, when the mud released its grip and wagons could roll. The war would not wait for perfection.
For the Confederacy!
Among the soldiers, the reorganization bred both frustration and a strange new energy. Old comrades were split up, thrown into different commands, told to trust officers they had never followed before. But at the same time, there was a sense that something different was afoot. Grant's presence among them mattered. He was not a distant strategist in Washington but a stocky figure in a plain uniform, seen riding with Meade, stopping to inspect, rarely speaking but always watching. He had little flair, no dramatic speeches, no waving of hats, but his quiet confidence seeped through the ranks. If he believed they could push straight into the Confederacy's heart, then perhaps they could. The Confederate side read these changes through a haze of scouts' reports and newspaper leaks. Lee knew that a man promoted to lieutenant general carried not only authority but political weight. He guessed that the Union would attempt a grand offensive, striking in multiple places, but he could not know how it would be coordinated. What he did know was that the Army of Northern Virginia, his army, would remain the central target. Whatever maneuvers happened in Georgia or the Carolinas, the campaign in Virginia would decide the fate of Richmond and perhaps the Confederacy itself. As the weeks lengthened toward May, the pieces aligned. The Union Army, now reorganized and reinforced by thousands of former artillerymen in their ill-fitting infantry gear, stood ready. Supply depots sprouted like mushrooms along the rivers, barrels of hardtack and salted pork stacked high under canvas. Horses were shod, wagons greased, rifles inspected. Grant waited only for the roads to harden. When the order came, the great machine would creak forward, not towards safety, but into the dense, choking woods that lay between them and Lee's army. In campfires at night, soldiers speculated about the coming push. Some feared another Chancellorsville, another humiliating dance in the wilderness where the Confederates knew every stream and ridge. Others whispered that this time was different, because Grant was different. He did not play for position, he played to end things. The question was not whether he would move, but whether Lee could stop him once he did. For now, though, all was preparation, the heavy silence before the storm. Soon, the green labyrinth would swallow them all. The first days of May 1864 dawned with a deceptive gentleness. Spring birds sang along the Rapidan River, its waters sliding quietly through Virginia's woods. But beneath that calm surface, the largest army yet assembled in the Eastern Theater prepared to move. 120,000 Union soldiers, reorganized and reinforced, now stood waiting for the order. Wagons groaned under barrels of salt pork, kegs of powder, crates of hardtack. The men had been drilled, their boots resoled, their rifles inspected and re-inspected. It was as if the army itself had drawn a long breath, holding it, ready to exhale into the wilderness. Grant's strategy was characteristically blunt: cross the Rapidan quickly at Germanna and Ely's fords, march hard, and try to slip through the tangled forest before Robert E. Lee could react. If all went well, they would emerge on the other side, open ground behind them, the Army of Northern Virginia forced into battle on terms Grant could control. To the north, the Confederacy's scouts had been watching, but Grant's movements had an energy that made prediction difficult. Lee, anticipating an offensive, had placed his corps under A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell in position to intercept. James Longstreet, his most trusted hammer, lingered further south at Gordonsville, ready to rush in wherever the storm broke. The wilderness was no ordinary battlefield. Veterans remembered Chancellorsville the year before: dense undergrowth, thorn vines, second-growth pine and scrub oak pressing close on every side. A man could not see 50 yards ahead. Smoke hung low, gunfire sounded like muffled thunder, and orders disintegrated in the thickets. Soldiers called it a place where battle itself seemed blind. Cavalry lost their power, artillery had no fields to dominate, and infantry clashed in sudden, brutal fragments, brigades stumbling upon each other like men groping in the dark.
Keep pushing, we're almost there.
Fire was a constant terror. One stray spark could turn the underbrush into a furnace. At dawn on May 4th, blue columns began to flow across pontoon bridges laid at Germanna Ford. The river's mist curled around them as Union cavalry drove off Confederate pickets. At Ely's Ford, another column crossed, the water shining silver around their knees. General James Wilson's cavalry division pushed toward Wilderness Tavern, a cluster of weathered buildings at a crossroads, while David Gregg's troopers secured the ghostly ruins of Chancellorsville before moving on to Aldrich. The great machine moved, but slowly. Roads were narrow, cut by wagons into deep ruts, and the size of the force meant delays multiplied like echoes. What Grant had hoped would be a day's passage stretched thin, his army strung out like a chain through the trees. Lee had anticipated the move. He watched Meade's ponderous columns thread into the forest and knew this was his chance. If the Union army cleared the woods, its superior numbers would roll him flat. But here, in the wilderness, the terrain was his ally. It could smother Grant's advantage, choke his formations, and give the Confederates, 65,000 strong after absorbing scattered commands, the chance to fight on equal footing. Lee's plan was clear: hold the Federals in the forest until Longstreet's corps could arrive, then spring the trap. He ordered Ewell and Hill forward to engage, not yet to destroy, but to delay and pin. That night, the two armies camped astonishingly close, barely 2 miles apart, each largely unaware of how near the other had come. Fires flickered behind brush, officers whispered over maps, and the dark woods breathed with an uneasy silence. Some Union soldiers still believed they faced only cavalry screams. Others noticed ominous signs: the faint echo of axes felling trees for breastworks, the shadow of Confederate scouts slipping through the gloom. For the men in blue, anticipation thickened.
Move forward.
They had crossed the Rapidan, as ordered. But where exactly was Lee? Some felt the thrill of a campaign beginning at last, the promise of a march toward Richmond. Others, veterans of past campaigns, muttered that Lee would not allow such an easy passage. In the darkness, the smell of pine needles and damp earth mingled with fear. On the Confederate side, men lay in silence, waiting for dawn. Lee's gamble was dangerous. He knew reinforcements were scarce, the Confederacy could not replace men as the Union did. But here, in this forest, he believed he could strike blows heavy enough to slow Grant's momentum. His officers, hardened by years of campaigns, understood the stakes. This might be their only chance to even the odds before the Union juggernaut crushed them. Thus, by the end of May 4th, the stage was set. Two armies crouched in the shadows of Virginia's green labyrinth, unaware of how savagely the next days would burn. The wilderness waited, indifferent, ready to consume men by the thousands. The war's next chapter was about to begin, and it would begin in fire. Dawn broke on May 5, 1864, with a pale sun filtering through tangled branches, casting fractured light across the wilderness. Union cavalry patrols rode cautiously along the orange plank road, their horses slowed by the oppressive thicket. 500 men dismounted, carbines ready, creeping forward through overhanging trees. What they found was no small cavalry scream,
but the vanguard of A.P. Hill's corps pressing down the same road. Gunfire cracked in the woods, sudden and close, like doors slamming in a corridor. The Federals fired their repeating carbines in frantic bursts, buying precious minutes as they fell back toward the intersection of Orange Plank and Brock Road, ground that would soon prove vital. Meade, initially convinced the opposition was minor, ordered Gouverneur Warren's Fifth Corps to attack along the Orange Turnpike. He believed he faced a division, maybe two, nothing more. In truth, Richard Ewell had entrenched his corps behind Saunders Field, following Lee's instructions to wait until Longstreet could arrive. Warren hesitated, eyeing the thick woods and recalling Chancellorsville's ghosts, but Meade's orders pressed him forward. At 1 p.m., blue-coated brigades surged into the thickets, muskets flashing in the shadows. It was a disaster. The terrain shattered cohesion, regiments became lost, tangled, isolated. Confederates poured volleys from behind cover, their fire emerging as if the forest itself spat lead. In the Union center, the Iron Brigade, once legendary, now worn thin, punched through the Confederate line briefly. For a heartbeat, it seemed victory was at hand. But the woods betrayed them. Surrounded, cut off, they were driven back in bloody fragments, their reputation preserved only in sacrifice. As the fighting intensified, nature itself became an enemy. Flames leapt from underbrush where musket sparks or artillery fire had found tinder. Dry leaves ignited, and a cruel wind carried fire into the heart of the battlefield. Soon Saunders Field roared with inferno, smoke choking the wounded left behind. Men trapped between the lines screamed as fire consumed them. Witnesses later wrote of the horror, soldiers of both sides dropping their weapons to drag comrades away from the blaze, others paralyzed by the sight of men burning alive. By mid-afternoon, the forest was alive with chaos. On the Union left, a swampy stretch broke apart the advance, creating gaps the Confederates swiftly exploited. Confederates emerged in small groups, attacking like wolves in a thicket. On the right, confusion reigned as miscommunication spread, and entire brigades fought blind, unable to see who was friend or foe. The thunder of musketry mingled with the screams of men and the crackle of fire, an unholy orchestra conducted by terrain and chance. At 3:30 p.m., reinforcements arrived, John Sedgwick's Sixth Corps. Their presence stabilized the line, preventing a total collapse. They too were swallowed by the trees, firing into shadows, advancing by yards and losing by dozens. Still, their arrival turned the slaughter into stalemate. Neither side could claim victory as the sun fell, but both could count staggering losses. Meanwhile, to the south, Hill pressed hard against the Orange Plank and Brock Road intersection, hoping to wedge between Union corps and split them apart. If he succeeded, Grant's army might fracture into isolated fragments, each vulnerable to destruction. Meade dispatched George Getty's division from the 6th Corps to hold the crossroads. At noon, Hill's brigade struck with fury, but Getty's men held. For hours they clung to the intersection, refusing to break even as Confederate volleys scythed through their lines. At last, Hancock's 2nd Corps arrived around 3:30 p.m., sweeping into counterattack. Hill's advance faltered, and night wrapped the battlefield in a grim stalemate. When darkness came, fires still smoldered. Across Saunders Field and the thickets beyond, soldiers of both armies faced a terrible choice: risk bullets to drag wounded comrades from the flames, or leave them to die shrieking. Many men, gray and blue alike, worked through the night side by side, pulling the injured clear as the fires crept closer. In that brief interlude, uniforms ceased to matter. Humanity outweighed allegiance, if only for an hour. By the time the stars burned overhead, both armies knew the truth. They were entangled in a place where numbers counted less than courage and where the wilderness itself devoured order.
Hold the line!
Lee had won his opening gambit. Grant was pinned inside the forest. But Grant, unlike others before him, did not consider retreat. The fight would continue in the choking smoke, in the undergrowth where visibility was measured in feet. Tomorrow, the battle would ignite again, fiercer still. The wilderness had claimed its first day of blood, and the tally was grim. Yet neither army had yielded. Both generals, silent and calculating in their headquarters, prepared for another dawn. The fires had not burned out, they had only marked the beginning. The morning of May 6 began not with sunlight, but with a haze so thick it seemed the forest itself exhaled smoke. Before the Federals could act, Richard Ewell's corps lunged at the Union right in a furious dawn attack. The intent was simple: keep Grant pinned until Longstreet's reinforcements could arrive. The woods erupted with gunfire, muskets flashing like lightning between the trunks. Visibility shrank to yards, men fired at sounds, shadows, at the impression of a hat above brush. The ground shook with the thunder of close combat, but the line bent without breaking. On the Union left, Hancock's 2nd Corps had prepared to strike Hill's exposed flank. At 5 o'clock, they surged forward. The Confederates, weary and caught off guard, faltered. Hill's brigades buckled backward, retreating in confusion. Union cheers filled the air, and for a brief, heady moment it seemed the tide was turning. Confederate artillery fired through their own retreating men to slow the advance, but even this could not stem the blue wave. Panic spread through Hill's corps, a collapse beginning. Then, from the south, salvation arrived. Longstreet's corps, having marched since 1 in the morning, came up the Orange Plank Road with the legendary Texas Brigade in the lead. Dusty, exhausted, and under strength, the Texans nevertheless surged forward with the ferocity of men who knew the moment demanded nothing less. But before they could strike, a scene unfolded that soldiers would never forget. General Robert E. Lee himself rode into their front ranks, hat off, his horse Traveler stepping high through the smoke. His intent was to lead them into the charge personally. The Texans, shocked, broke into shouts of protest. Lee to the rear! Lee to the rear! They refused to advance until their beloved general withdrew to safety. Lee, visibly moved, allowed himself to be led back, his presence replaced by their thunderous cry. With that, the Texans hurled themselves into the storm, charging Hancock's men at Widow Tapp's farm. The attack was savage. Of the 800 Texans who surged forward, barely 250 returned. Yet their sacrifice bought time, stabilizing Hill's crumbling flank. The Confederate line, reinforced by Longstreet's divisions, stiffened against the Union tide. Smoke, morning mist, and powder blended into a pall that reduced vision to 10 feet. In the confusion, regiments overlapped, fighting dissolved into melee, and the battlefield became a boiling cauldron where command dissolved into survival. At 10 o'clock, Longstreet's engineers discovered an opportunity. Through a miscommunication, the Union left was exposed. Longstreet seized the moment, sending fresh brigades slamming into the gap. Hancock's corps staggered backward, pressed hard toward the vital Brock Road line. For a moment, victory seemed near, Lee's army poised to crush a wing of the Union host. But fate intervened. Riding forward through the haze to survey the situation, Longstreet and his staff suddenly came under fire, from their own men. Confusion in the undergrowth had caused friendly units to mistake them for Federals. Bullets cut down staff officers, and Longstreet himself was struck in the throat and shoulder, grievously wounded. The man who had just rescued Lee's army was carried from the field, blood soaking his uniform. In an instant, the Confederate momentum stalled. Burnside's 9th Corps now entered the fight, striking at Longstreet's flank. Wildfires kindled again, racing toward breastworks hastily built of logs and brush. Confederate soldiers seized the burning barricades, fighting in smoke and flame until Union counterattacks drove them back. The battlefield dissolved into chaos, musketry muffled by fire's roar, wounded men choking on smoke, whole units swallowed by the forest. By late afternoon, Lee ordered one final attack on the Union right. His men advanced bravely, pushing the Federals back nearly a mile. But the effort could not be sustained. Darkness fell, and with it came another grim night in the burning woods. Both armies built hasty fortifications under the glow of scattered fires, pausing only to drag the wounded from advancing flames. Men stumbled through the smoke carrying comrades, not caring whether the uniform on the arms slung across their shoulders was blue or gray. The wilderness had claimed its second day, more terrible than the first. Nearly 30,000 men lay dead, wounded, or missing. For the Confederates, the cost was irreplaceable. For the Union, the cost was staggering but survivable. Lee had bloodied Grant, perhaps even rattled him, but unlike his predecessors, Grant did not withdraw. He did not retreat across the Rapidan. That night, word spread through the Federal ranks, the army would not turn back. The campaign would continue. For the first time, soldiers realized their commander was different. The wilderness had been hell, but it had not been the end. Tomorrow, they would march south. When the smoke of May 6 drifted into the night air, men on both sides expected the familiar pattern to unfold. The Union, bloodied and tangled in the wilderness, would surely retreat back across the Rapidan to lick its wounds. Veterans of the Army of the Potomac, hardened by years of disappointment, muttered to each other in the gloom that it would be the same as before: fight, bleed, retreat, reset. They had seen it under McClellan, Pope, Burnside, Hooker, even Meade after Gettysburg. Lee would strike, the Federals would flinch, and Virginia's forests would swallow another campaign. But Ulysses S. Grant was not McClellan, nor Burnside, nor Hooker. His decision that night cut like a blade through the haze of tradition. Sitting in his headquarters, he studied maps by lantern light, smoke curling from his cigar. He had seen enough to know that further assaults inside the burning forest were folly. The terrain itself fought for Lee. Yet he also knew something Lee had not yet fully reckoned with: Grant would not turn back. Rather than retreat, he resolved to pivot south toward Richmond. If Lee would not be destroyed in the wilderness, then Grant would move around him, dragging the Confederates into the open or forcing them to defend the roads to the capital. It was a gamble, but one calculated with cold precision. Lee could not afford to let him slip by, he would have to follow, and the war would remain a relentless chase. News of this decision spread unevenly through the Union camps. At first, men groaned when ordered to disengage, convinced they were marching back across the Rapidan. A bitter weariness filled their hearts. But when the columns turned not north, but south, toward Spotsylvania Courthouse, the mood transformed. Cheers rippled through the ranks, an astonished, almost disbelieving joy. "We are not retreating," one soldier exclaimed. For the first time, they marched away from a bloody field without the taste of defeat. The army had been bloodied, yes, but not beaten, and certainly not abandoned. Meanwhile, Lee had reached the same conclusion as Grant: the wilderness was a coffin for decisive battle. If Grant was not attacking, then he must be moving. Lee could not let the Federals outpace him toward Richmond. Both generals, independently, fixed their eyes on Spotsylvania Courthouse, a vital crossroads of roads and supply lines. Whoever reached it first would shape the next phase of the campaign. The cavalry became the vanguard of this race. For days they had skirmished bitterly in the woods around Todd's Tavern, testing each other's strength. Now Jeb Stuart's Confederate horsemen and Philip Sheridan's Federal troopers clashed in earnest. Saber met saber, carbines cracked at close range, horses screamed as they fell in tangled masses. Dust and smoke veiled the fields, and neither side yielded easily. On May 7th, Sheridan threw his weight forward. His numbers told, but at the critical moment Hill's Confederate infantry began to arrive, tipping the balance. Sheridan withdrew, furious but alive, leaving Stuart to claim the field. Lee had won the race by inches. Spotsylvania would be his ground to fortify, and he would make it deadly. Yet in the Union ranks, something intangible had shifted. The order to march south had rewritten their understanding of the campaign. No longer would they suffer the dismal cycle of advance and retreat. Their commander intended to press forward until the Confederacy broke. The veterans sang on the march, songs ragged but defiant. Even in exhaustion, they felt the momentum of history behind them. For Grant, the decision was more than a maneuver. It was a statement: this war would not end with stalemates in forests or retreats to winter quarters. He would march, always march, until Lee's army was forced into the open and destroyed. The wilderness had been a nightmare of fire and smoke, but its lesson was clear: Grant's campaign would not be turned back. The army moved south, toward Spotsylvania, toward trenches and blood yet to be spilled. Both generals had chosen the same ground, and their armies, battered but unbroken, converged once more. The chase had entered a new phase, and the forests behind them still smoldered, marking the path of a war that refused to die. The roads south toward Spotsylvania were narrow and choked with dust, lined with trampled wildflowers and churned earth. Men marched with their boots caked in mud and their throats raw from smoke, but there was a strange electricity in the air. They were not retreating, they were advancing. The veterans who had long since given up on cheering began to hum scraps of songs. Some sang outright, their voices cracked but defiant. For the first time in years, the Army of the Potomac felt it was pursuing, not fleeing. But this renewed spirit was about to crash against cold reality. Spotsylvania Courthouse, the crossroads that commanded the routes to Richmond, was already filling with Confederates. Stuart's cavalry had delayed Sheridan just long enough for Longstreet's battered divisions and Hill's survivors to push forward, erecting hasty barricades of logs and dirt. By the time Union columns pressed into the area, they found Confederate trenches dug into the ridges around Brock Road and Laurel Hill, the high ground dominating the approaches. At dawn on May 8, Warren's 5th Corps, eager to seize the crossroads, smashed against these defenses. They expected to brush aside dismounted cavalry. Instead, they found seasoned Confederate infantry, muskets braced against breastworks. The Federals surged up the slope in ragged waves, bayonets flashing, only to be thrown back in bloody confusion. Smoke thickened, musket balls hissed like angry bees, and the cries of the wounded mingled with the thunder of artillery. Again and again they tried, and again they failed. Laurel Hill was stained with blue uniforms by mid-morning. The failure enraged Meade. His temper, sharp even in calm moments, now flared like dry tinder. He cursed Warren, cursed the cavalry, cursed the entire sluggish pace of the pursuit. Sheridan, who had bristled under Meade's criticism for days, finally snapped. In front of stunned staff officers, the two men shouted each other down. Meade accused Sheridan of mediocrity and half measures. Sheridan roared back that if given freedom, he could thrash Jeb Stuart once and for all. The air crackled with fury, two generals red-faced, threatening to tear the army's command structure apart. It was Grant who intervened, his voice steady, his presence like a stone in a storm. He listened to Sheridan's heated claims, weighed the risks, and then quietly granted him permission. "Go out and do it," he said. With that, Sheridan was unleashed on the raid he had long wanted, to strike Stuart directly, sever Lee's supply lines, and prove himself in the open field. Sheridan left with 10,000 cavalrymen and 32 cannon, a thunderbolt set loose into the Confederate rear. Meanwhile, the rest of the army had no choice but to grind against Spotsylvania's growing lines. Confederate troops extended their entrenchments mile by mile, clawing earth into walls, planting sharpened stakes, weaving defenses as if the war itself had turned into one long trench. Grant and Meade saw it with cold clarity. Lee meant to stop them here, not in maneuver but in fortress. If they wanted Richmond, they would have to pry Lee out of his earthworks or bleed themselves trying. The clash at Brock Road was just the beginning. The race had ended, the pursuit had narrowed, and now both armies dug in, their fates entwined on the ridges around Spotsylvania Courthouse. For the Union soldiers, the joy of marching south began to curdle into grim resignation. They had not been beaten, but they were not yet victors. Ahead lay trenches, storms of lead, and battles fought over mere yards of earth. In the days to come, Spotsylvania would become synonymous with some of the most brutal fighting of the war. But in that moment, amid the shouted quarrels of generals and the bloody slope of Laurel Hill, the men knew only that the campaign had entered a new circle of hell. The wilderness had burned behind them, but here the earth itself was turning against them. By May 9th, the Virginia countryside around Spotsylvania had become a landscape of dirt and sweat, spades and rifles. In just 2 days, Confederate soldiers had carved 4 miles of trenches into the earth, fortifications bristling with sharpened stakes and logs. The centerpiece of this line was a bulging arc known as the Mule Shoe Salient, a curve in the defenses that jutted forward like a beckoning fist. Lee had created both strength and vulnerability. The salient allowed concentrated fire on attackers but also left its defenders exposed to being surrounded if breached. The Federals responded in kind. Facing the enemy across open ground, they dug their own parallel lines. Men who had once scoffed at the shovel now worshipped it. Dirt flew by the ton, trenches deepened by the hour, and earthworks rose like scar tissue across the landscape. Spotsylvania was fast becoming a siege within a battle, a grinding contest where the musket and the spade held equal power. That morning, tragedy struck the Union High Command. Major General John Sedgwick, beloved by his 6th Corps, walked the lines personally to steady his men as Confederate sharpshooters picked off officers with uncanny precision. When his soldiers ducked, he chided them with a wry smile. "Why are you dodging like this? They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance." Moments later, a bullet struck him under the eye. He fell instantly, his words remembered as both gallows humor and epitaph. The news spread quickly, a gut punch to morale. Sedgwick had been steady, paternal, a soldier's general. Now the 6th Corps felt suddenly orphaned.
Forward, men, for the south!
Grant, unshaken outwardly, pressed on with his broader plan. He suspected Lee was shifting troops eastward, thinning his left. To exploit this, he ordered Hancock's 2nd Corps to cross the Pearl River and attack. But Hancock, wary of the strong defenses at Blockhouse Bridge, delayed to bring up artillery. The pause proved fatal. Confederate reinforcements rushed in, blocking his advance and forcing him into a fighting withdrawal. What might have been an opportunity dissolved into another bloody stalemate. Meanwhile, Sheridan's great cavalry raid thundered into motion. 10,000 Blue Riders, accompanied by artillery, galloped south toward Lee's supply lines. Their hooves churned Virginia's roads to dust as they aimed for Beaver Dam Station, a vital depot. Along the way, they cut telegraph wires, burned wagons, and liberated more than 400 Union prisoners who staggered out of Confederate captivity with tears in their eyes. The cavalrymen cheered, the raid feeling almost like a reprieve from the claustrophobic trenches. Yet Sheridan knew the real test lay ahead. Jeb Stuart was already moving to intercept. Back at Spotsylvania, the lines groaned under relentless skirmishing. Sharpshooters made every movement deadly. Men could scarcely raise their heads above the parapet without inviting a bullet. Artillery duels thundered across the open fields, shells shrieking overhead, exploding in geysers of dirt and limbs. Rain began to fall intermittently, turning trenches into muddy graves in waiting. Soldiers huddled in the muck, cold water soaking their uniforms, gnawed by exhaustion and the constant smell of wet powder and decay. In this environment, Grant experimented with new ways to break Lee's line. Colonel Emory Upton, a sharp-minded officer, proposed abandoning the slow volleys and ordered ranks. Instead, he envisioned a swift, silent assault, 12 regiments running across open ground in column, not stopping to fire until they had crashed into the Confederate works. It was a daring tactic, born of desperation, and Grant approved. The stage was set for one of the war's first modern-style storming attacks. If Upton succeeded, Spotsylvania could be the key to splitting Lee's army in two. If he failed, the price would be paid in rivers of blood. In the trenches that night, Union soldiers whispered of something new coming, something different from the weary rhythm of charge and repulse. The air was heavy with tension, the rain spattering softly on stacked rifles, as both armies prepared for the next thunderclap of slaughter. The earthworks loomed, the mule's shoe curved forward, and the men in blue and gray stared at each other across the killing fields, knowing the next dawn would bring either breakthrough or disaster. On May 10, 1864, as the rain slackened and mist clung to the Virginia fields, Colonel Emory Upton prepared to test his radical idea. 12 Union regiments, stripped down for speed, formed silently in column opposite a portion of the Mule Shoe salient. They were told not to stop, not to fire, not to hesitate. They would charge like a spear thrust, smashing through the line before defenders had time to reload. Upton's voice cut through the morning air, "Forward." At 6 p.m., the column surged. Muskets clutched at the shoulder, bayonets fixed, the men broke into a run across the open field. Confederate fire lashed at them, but the narrow column punched through, leaping into the breastworks with a roar. For a fleeting, breathless moment, it worked. Gray-clad defenders reeled backward as blues surged into the trenches, fighting hand-to-hand in a storm of smoke and steel. Men swung muskets like clubs, stabbed with bayonets, clawed at each other in the mud. The breakthrough had come, but the support had not. The regiments meant to follow and widen the breach faltered, delayed by confusion and heavy fire. Upton's men found themselves alone, surrounded by Confederate counterattacks from both flanks. The moment of triumph twisted into desperation. Fighting with savage determination, Upton held as long as he could before ordering a withdrawal. His men staggered back across the field, carrying wounded comrades, leaving hundreds behind. Though the attack ultimately failed, Grant recognized something vital in the experiment. Upton's storming column had revealed a truth: Confederate earthworks, once thought nearly impregnable, could be pierced by shock and speed. The idea would grow, echoed later in the great assaults of Cold Harbor and foreshadowing trench tactics of a future world war. For Upton, the failed victory was both a frustration and a prophecy. Elsewhere along the lines, the day had been no less bloody. Warren, acting without full coordination, launched his Fifth Corps prematurely, only to be hurled back in ruin. The delays and missteps meant Grant's larger coordinated assault lost its timing. Still, in his headquarters, cigar clenched between his teeth, Grant noted Upton's results. He was not discouraged. On the contrary, he ordered that the tactic be repeated, but on a far larger scale. Meanwhile, Sheridan's cavalry thundered southward, drawing Lee's eye away from Spotsylvania. Stuart, ever watchful, gathered his outnumbered troopers and spurred them to pursuit. Their clash was inevitable, and it would come at a place soon to be remembered, Yellow Tavern. Back at Spotsylvania, the trenches reeked of death. Men could scarcely sleep for the constant rattle of sharpshooters and the occasional crash of artillery. The ground itself seemed to moan, littered with the fallen, many of whom could not yet be buried. Veterans muttered that Spotsylvania was becoming worse than the wilderness, not fire and trees this time, but mud and earthwork swallowing men whole. The soldiers sensed the storm building for something greater, something that would make even Upton's daring attack look like a prelude. Grant's orders made it clear, on May 12, Hancock's entire Second Corps would strike at dawn, using Upton's column assault on a massive scale, aimed directly at the Mule Shoe. Supporting attacks would pin Confederate reserves along the line. It would be a gamble of unprecedented ferocity.
Come on, we can do this.
The Union soldiers braced themselves in silence. Rain pattered on their rifles stacked in pyramids, their boots sunk deep in mud. Somewhere in the dark, a bugler tested a note, quickly muffled. The men knew what awaited them, trenches filled with muskets, cannon at close range, hand-to-hand slaughter. Yet the order was set. The storm was coming. As night fell, the Mule Shoe loomed across the fields, its trenches filled with gray coats ready to meet the charge. But neither side knew just how savage the next day's fight would become. Spotsylvania was about to burn its name into history, not for maneuver, not for strategy, but for raw, unrelenting carnage. Before dawn on May 12, 1864, a thick mist lay over the fields of Spotsylvania, muffling sound and cloaking movement. In the Union camps, 20,000 men of Hancock's Second Corps rose in silence, their bayonets glinting faintly in the dim light. The order was simple: repeat Upton's column assault, but on a massive scale. Across from them, inside the great bulge of earthworks known as the Mule Shoe, Confederate defenders had unknowingly prepared themselves for catastrophe. Lee, convinced Grant was pulling back, had shifted artillery out of the salient to be ready for pursuit. At the very moment it was needed most, the Mule Shoe stood dangerously exposed. At 4:35 a.m., Hancock's men advanced, boots sucking at the mud, rain dripping from their kepis. The fog thickened, and for once, the weather was a cloak rather than a curse. The blue wave moved quickly, quietly, then erupted with a shout as it smashed into the Confederate line. Muskets cracked, bayonets plunged, men leapt into the trenches with a fury that defied description. The defending division was annihilated in minutes. Thousands of Confederates were captured, guns seized, the line torn wide open. But Lee reacted with ferocity. Reinforcements poured into the breach, brigades charging into the fog, colliding with Federals already in the trenches. What followed defies easy telling. The Mule Shoe became a maelstrom of hand-to-hand combat lasting for nearly 20 hours straight. Rain poured, turning the earthworks into rivers of mud and blood. Men fought ankle-deep in filth, slipping as they stabbed and fired at point-blank range. They clawed over parapets, shot across them, wrestled in the muck below. Muskets became clubs, bayonets snapped, men tore at each other with fists and teeth when weapons failed. The place earned a name that would echo for generations, the Bloody Angle. Trees as thick as a man's waist were cut down by rifle fire alone, trunks splintered by the sheer volume of lead. In some places, corpses piled chest-high, soldiers forced to climb over the dead to strike at the living. Eyewitnesses spoke of the rain running red, of men drowning in the trenches, pressed beneath the bodies of friend and foe alike. Grant and Lee both hurled reinforcements into the vortex. Every attempt to break free only fed more men into the slaughter. By nightfall, the lines were no longer lines but seething masses locked in deadly embrace. The cries of the wounded mingled with thunder, the crack of muskets with the hiss of rain. A soldier later recalled that the fighting was so constant, so intimate, that the sound of gunfire was drowned out by the screams. At dawn on May 13th, after nearly a full day of uninterrupted horror, the contest ebbed. Hancock's men still held parts of the Confederate line, but the cost was staggering. Lee's engineers, working feverishly, had constructed a second line behind the Mule Shoe. The Federals, bloodied and exhausted, found themselves staring at yet another wall of earthworks, their momentary triumph denied. The field they left behind was a vision of hell. Survivors told of trenches filled with the dead, of wounded men suffocating beneath piles of bodies, of rainwater mingled with gore until the ground itself seemed to weep. No other moment in the overland campaign would surpass the sheer brutality of Spotsylvania's Bloody Angle. It was a vision of what modern war could become, relentless, close, mechanized by numbers and earthworks rather than courage alone. For the soldiers who lived through it, Spotsylvania was seared into memory as a place where humanity itself seemed to vanish. They spoke of it in whispers, their voices lowering when they remembered the screams, the mud, the endless rain of bullets. The Union had gained ground, but not victory. Lee's army still stood, battered but unbroken. In his headquarters, Grant smoked silently, his face unreadable. He had seen what had been purchased at Spotsylvania, not decision, not collapse, but attrition. It was not the clean triumph the North had prayed for. It was something darker, a war turning into a grinder that would spare neither side. And yet, he did not stop. He would never stop. The campaign must continue south. The Bloody Angle had shown what persistence could achieve, and what it could cost. The rains came heavy on May 13th, hammering down on the scarred fields of Spotsylvania. Water filled the trenches, drowning powder, soaking uniforms, and turning the ground into a sucking mire. Men crouched under ponchos or blankets, their faces pale and eyes hollow after the carnage of the Bloody Angle. The wounded moaned through the night, many trapped in mud too deep to crawl free. A strange silence descended, not peace, but exhaustion. Both armies had reached a breaking point. Grant understood his soldiers could endure no more direct assaults for the moment. The enemy are obstinate and seem to have found the last ditch, he wired to Washington, his words spare but weighted. He had hoped Spotsylvania would bring decisive collapse, but instead, it had sunk into stalemate. And yet, he would not concede. Grant's resolve remained iron. If one path was blocked, he would simply shift, maneuver, keep moving south until Lee was forced into the open again. Over the next week, the battlefront became a slow-moving siege. Both armies extended their trench lines, eastward and southward, in a grim dance of spades. Soldiers fought skirmishes for ridges, for patches of woods, for a few yards of earth. Sharpshooters became assassins, lurking in trees, picking off any man foolish enough to show himself. The sound of bullets striking wood, thwack, 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 echoed endlessly. Artillery roared in brief, furious exchanges, then fell silent, only to resume again with no warning. The battlefield seemed alive, but not with maneuver, alive with grinding attrition. On May 18, Grant tested the Confederate lines once more. Believing Lee had thinned his defenses, he ordered a renewed assault on the Mule Shoe. But when Union forces surged forward, they were met with withering fire. Lee's men had not abandoned the trenches, they had only reinforced them. The Federals were repulsed with heavy loss. Grant now accepted what had become undeniable: Spotsylvania could not be taken by storm. Worse still, grim news arrived from other theaters. In the Shenandoah Valley, Franz Sigel had suffered defeat at New Market, his men fleeing before a smaller Confederate force. To the west, Union raiders had succeeded in damaging railroads and saltworks, but lacked the explosives to demolish bridges or mines completely. Their retreat left the campaign half-finished, its promises unkept. At Bermuda Hundred, Benjamin Butler had squandered his advantage, allowing PGT Beauregard to bottle up 33,000 Union soldiers with just 18,000 Confederates. Grant, with characteristic bluntness, described Butler as corked in a bottle, trapped by his own timidity. For Lee, these reports were lifelines. His thin gray army still faced Grant's hammer blows, but Confederate successes elsewhere kept hope flickering in Richmond. Reinforcements trickled in, 10,000 men detached from Beauregard's lines, sent to bolster Lee. It was a fragile hope, but enough to prolong the fight. For Grant, the lesson was bitter but clarifying. Clever maneuvers by subordinates had failed him. Sigel had fled, Butler had stalled, and even Sheridan's raid, though it had killed Stuart at Yellow Tavern, had not crippled Confederate cavalry. If brilliance could not end the war, then brute persistence would. The Union could bleed and still stand, the Confederacy could not. The arithmetic of attrition was now the strategy. In the trenches, soldiers absorbed this reality in their own way. They fought and dug, until their hands were blistered and their nerves raw. They endured endless rain, mud waist-deep, rations spoiled, lice crawling in their uniforms. Many wrote home that Spotsylvania was worse than any battle they had ever known, not for a single day of horror, but for the endless, grinding misery. On the night of May 20th, Grant made his choice. He would disengage from Spotsylvania. Quietly, under cover of darkness, the Union Army began to shift south once more. The dead were left behind, the trenches abandoned to the rain, and the campaign lurched forward again. Grant had failed to break Lee at Spotsylvania, but he had not been broken himself. That, more than anything, marked the difference between him and the generals who came before. The war would not pause. The chase continued. And Lee, reading the smoke of Grant's abandoned campfires, knew he was being forced again to move, to match steps with an enemy who would never turn back. The bloody stalemate of Spotsylvania was over, but the war of exhaustion had only just begun. The weary blue columns swung south, their boots striking sodden earth, their rifles glinting faintly under the gray skies. By May 23, the Union Army had reached the North Anna River, where Lee, ever the gambler, prepared a trap. The Confederates, though battered, dug in along a V-shaped line anchored on the river crossings. It was a design meant to echo Gettysburg in reverse. Whichever Union wing attacked first would be crushed, and then Lee would pivot to destroy the other. It was one of Lee's boldest stratagems, a chance to turn Grant's relentless advance into a disaster. But fortune deserted him at the critical moment. The general was struck by illness, likely acute heart trouble that left him weak, racked by diarrhea, barely able to sit a horse. With Longstreet still recovering from his wilderness wound in A.P. Hill sick as well, no Confederate commander had the authority or vision to spring the trap. The plan remained ink on paper while the armies skirmished in the mud. Grant's men crossed at Jericho Mills and Chesterfield Bridge, testing the Confederate defenses. At Jericho Mills, Warren's 5th Corps fought off a fierce counterattack, the Confederates surging across open fields only to be repelled with heavy loss. At Chesterfield, Hancock's 2nd Corps forced a lodgment despite determined resistance. The river crossings were bloody, but they held. Grant had slipped past another potential snare. Still, the lines that emerged along the North Anna were awkward. The Union Army found itself divided by the V of Lee's defenses, each wing dangerously isolated. Grant recognized the peril. He knew that if Lee had been strong enough, he might have crushed one corps before the other could assist.
We can do it.
For once, the great Federal engine paused, unwilling to blunder into a disaster. For the soldiers, North Anna was less about great assaults than about the grinding routine of trench and skirmish. Men dug rifle pits, exchanged constant fire with sharpshooters, and endured days of heat and hunger. The stench of unburied dead wafted across the lines, and the river itself seemed thick with smoke and decay. It was another battlefield where nature and exhaustion fought alongside musket and cannon. Grant studied the enemy across those trenches and made a decision. Lee, weakened and hesitant, would not be drawn into battle here. The positions were too strong, the risk too high. Once again, he would disengage and slip south. The movement would be costly, but not as costly as impaling his army on Lee's sharpened V. For Lee, the episode was haunting. He had built the perfect snare, but his body had betrayed him. The Confederacy's chances to strike decisive blows were dwindling, not because of lack of skill or courage, but because time and flesh could no longer be commanded as before. His army still stood, but attrition gnawed at it relentlessly, and reinforcements were scarce. He must fight, but every fight left him poorer. For Grant, the lesson was the opposite. His army bled, but it endured. Each time he pulled southward, reinforcements and supplies flowed behind him. He could afford to shift, to try again. The Confederacy could not. The war was becoming not a series of battles but a campaign of exhaustion, and Grant intended to press until Lee had nothing left to give. Thus, at the North Anna, a trap failed to spring, and the armies slid once more along their terrible course. Soldiers packed up their gear, shouldered rifles, and marched through mud, weary but grimly determined. Grant's order was unchanging: move south, always south. If the river could not stop them, then Lee's army must retreat again. The chase pressed onward, and the next collision loomed already in the fields ahead. The last days of May found the two armies locked again in a weary dance of marches and countermarches. Grant's columns, grim but determined, swung southward once more, shadowed closely by Lee's veterans. By now, the men in blue had grown used to the rhythm: march, dig, fight, bleed, then march again. Yet every step carried them closer to Richmond, and that knowledge lent a strange momentum, even as fatigue gnawed at their bones. At Totopotomoy Creek on May 28, Lee struck first.
We can do this,
Hill's
men.
corps, though
Fight
weakened
for
by
your
sickness and
freedom!
exhaustion, lunged at Warren's 5th Corps, which was awkwardly positioned near the creek's banks. The assault was fierce but poorly coordinated, volleys of Union fire cut it down. For the Federals, it was a grim reassurance: Lee could still lash out, but his army no longer had the weight to break them.
Keep moving, men!
Meanwhile, Grant prepared another sidestep. His true goal was not Totopotomoy but the crossroads at Old Cold Harbor, a few miles east. Control of that junction would give him direct access to Richmond and the railroads that fed it. Cavalry would be the key once again. Sheridan, returned from his raid and a bloody triumph at Yellow Tavern, now spearheaded the drive. On May 31st, his troopers clashed with Confederate cavalry around Old Cold Harbor in a swirling, dust-choked battle of sabers and carbines. Sheridan held firm, his Spencer rifles spitting deadly fire, and by nightfall the crossroads was in Union hands. Lee, recognizing the danger, rushed infantry toward the position. On June 1st, Union reinforcements began to arrive as well, infantry corps slogging in from different directions. At twilight, Grant ordered an assault. Blue lines advanced into the teeth of Confederate defenses, pushing them back slightly but paying dearly in blood. Both armies clung stubbornly to the ground, and by night the field lay littered with bodies, neither side willing to yield. The following day, June 2nd, should have been a pause to breathe. The men were spent, their uniforms stiff with dried sweat, their stomachs hollow. But Grant, convinced Lee was on his last legs, prepared for something far greater, a general assault by the entire Union Army at dawn on June 3rd. He gave his corps commanders wide discretion, trusting them to judge the ground before them. It was a decision rooted in confidence but also in overextension. Reconnaissance was scant, and the Confederate works were stronger than they appeared. That night, Union soldiers sharpened bayonets, whispered prayers, and scrawled names on scraps of paper to pin to their jackets, identification for when they fell. Veterans sensed what was coming, and many dreaded it. Letters written in flickering candlelight spoke of foreboding, of the terrible fields they had already seen, and of the fear that tomorrow might eclipse them all. Lee's army, though thin, dug in feverishly. Trenches deepened, parapets strengthened, artillery carefully placed. They knew the blow was coming, and they prepared to meet it. The Confederates no longer dreamed of great victories, they dreamed only of holding. At Old Cold Harbor, the two armies poised for another storm. Behind them lay the Wilderness and Spotsylvania, fields already soaked in blood. Ahead lay the capital of the Confederacy. Between them stood a few miles of earthworks and a dawn that promised to be one of the darkest of the entire war. Dawn on June 3, 1864, broke with a pale, silvery light, the air heavy with humidity. At 4:30 a.m., Union bugles sounded, and the largest assault of the campaign surged forward. Tens of thousands of blue-coated soldiers stepped from their trenches and advanced toward Cold Harbor. The fields ahead were open, flat, and merciless, the Confederate works bristling with muskets and cannon scarcely 200 yards away. The result was instant carnage. Confederate fire erupted in devastating sheets, tearing through the advancing lines before they could close the distance. Entire regiments were cut down within minutes, men collapsing in heaps where they stood. Survivors pressed forward a few yards more, only to be scythed down again by relentless crossfire. Some reached the Confederate works, clambering up with bayonets ready, but were shot or stabbed before they could gain a foothold. By 7 a.m., barely 90 minutes after the attack began, the battle was effectively over. The Union Army had suffered nearly 7,000 casualties in what one soldier called a hopeless slaughter. Confederate losses were a fraction, around 1,500. The disparity was brutal, the outcome undeniable. Men pinned to the open fields lay helpless under the summer sun, unable to retreat or advance, their cries for water echoing for days. The stench of death soon hung thick across the lines. The reaction was swift and bitter. Northern newspapers thundered against Grant, branding him a butcher. Editorials claimed he had thrown away lives with reckless indifference. Soldiers themselves muttered the word in their camps, some writing home that they had been sacrificed needlessly. The psychological weight of Cold Harbor was immense, greater even than the physical losses. For the first time, Grant's men began to doubt not only their chances of victory, but the judgment of their commander. Yet Grant did not retreat. He acknowledged later that ordering the June 3rd assault was a mistake, one of the few times he admitted such a failure. But his resolve remained unshaken. He had no intention of abandoning the campaign, no matter the cost. Unlike his predecessors, he would not pull back and regroup. If Lee could not be broken by storm, he would be ground down by persistence. In Richmond, news of Cold Harbor was received with a grim mixture of relief and dread. Relief, because Lee had repelled the most massive assault yet hurled at his lines. Dread, because they knew the Union Army, unlike their own, could replace its losses. For every man who fell in blue, another recruit would take his place. For every gray uniform lost, there was no one left to fill it. Lee's army still held firm, but it was shrinking, thinning with every clash. For the soldiers, Cold Harbor was seared into memory as one of the war's most futile horrors. Survivors would later say they had pinned their names to their coats before the charge, so their bodies could be identified when they fell. Whether apocryphal or not, the story captured the essence of the day. Men marched forward knowing they were walking into death. The fields of Cold Harbor remained littered with the dead for days, many left unburied, their bodies bloating in the sun. The smell carried for miles. Buzzards circled endlessly. To soldiers on both sides, it was a vision of war stripped of all illusion, a machine of death grinding forward with no glory to redeem it. Cold Harbor had not broken the Union Army, but it had broken something in the hearts of many who fought there. Still, Grant would not stop. The campaign would shift again, this time not against breastworks head-on, but by maneuver, toward the James River and the rail hub of Petersburg. Cold Harbor was the nadir of the overland campaign, the darkest day in its ledger. Yet it was not the end. The wheel kept turning, southward still. In the aftermath of Cold Harbor, the air hung heavy with the smell of death. For 9 days the armies stared at each other across the trenches, a grim standoff broken only by skirmishes and the groans of the wounded left in no man's land. Men lay between the lines, crying for water, their voices growing weaker each hour until silence claimed them. The Union Army, shaken but not shattered, remained in position. Grant refused to order another frontal assault. He had learned the cost of battering directly at Lee's works. Instead, he turned to maneuver. His eyes shifted south, to the James River, a broad waterway that, if crossed, would outflank Lee entirely. Beyond it lay Petersburg, a rail hub with 5 lines feeding into Richmond. Take Petersburg, and Richmond would starve. It was a bold move, demanding secrecy and speed. If Lee guessed his intent, the Confederates could block him. But if Grant succeeded, he would force the Confederates into a new war, one they were ill-prepared to fight, a siege of attrition. To mask his movement, Grant ordered constant demonstrations at Lee's front. Skirmishers fired, artillery boomed, cavalry raided, all to convince the Confederates he still intended another attack. Meanwhile, Sheridan was sent on a fresh raid, clashing with Confederate cavalry at Trevilian Station on June 11th. The battle was fierce, swirling, and inconclusive, but it distracted Lee and kept his attention north of the James. Then, on the night of June 14th, the Union Army performed a feat of engineering brilliance. Under cover of darkness, Federal engineers built the longest pontoon bridge of the war, nearly 2,200 feet across the James River. By dawn, the Army of the Potomac was already marching over it, their columns stretching endlessly across the floating bridge. Cannon wheels rattled on planks, horses slipped and strained, wagons creaked, but the crossing was steady. The men sensed they were part of something monumental, an army of 100,000 slipping the noose around Richmond without Lee realizing it in time. Lee, when he discovered the maneuver, was stunned. His army, already stretched thin, could not be everywhere at once. For weeks he had parried Grant's blows, blocking him at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, North Anna, Cold Harbor. But now the Federals had shifted an entire army across a major river, bypassing his entrenched lines. The Confederacy's greatest general had been outmaneuvered, not by brilliance in battle, but by persistence, logistics, and sheer will. For the Union soldiers, the crossing of the James felt like a turning point. They were weary beyond words. Many had not changed clothes since May, lice crawled in their uniforms, and rations often failed to arrive on time. Yet as they marched south, they felt the campaign was closing in on its end. Richmond was no longer a distant dream but a city pressed against by the tightening coils of the Union Army. Still, hope was tempered by dread. They knew Petersburg would not fall easily. The Confederates had fortified it, and Lee was rushing troops to defend its lines. What lay ahead was no swift storming, but another grinding contest of trenches, cannon, and blood. The war was shifting shape, from a campaign of marches and open battle to something darker, a siege that could last months, even years. Grant had failed to destroy Lee in the open, but he had forced him back step by step, always southward, always closer to collapse. Now, with Petersburg before him and Richmond behind it, the Union Army prepared for a new chapter in the war, a chapter where patience, persistence, and sheer numbers would decide the fate of the Confederacy. Cold Harbor had been a nadir, but the crossing of the James was a resurrection of momentum. The great machine of war had pivoted again, and now its weight bore down on the last lifelines of Richmond. The end was not yet, but it was visible on the horizon. June 15, 1864. The fields outside Petersburg shimmered with summer heat, the air thick with the smell of pine and powder. For the Union, this city was not merely another target, it was the key. 5 railroads converged there, arteries feeding Richmond with food, ammunition, and reinforcements. Sever them, and the Confederate capital would starve. Grant knew it. Lee knew it. The question was who would act faster. The opportunity fell first to Benjamin Butler and the Army of the James. After slipping across the river, Butler dispatched 16,000 men toward Petersburg, whose defenses were at that moment held by barely 2,500 local militia and reserves, clerks, old men, and boys. It was, in essence, an undefended city. One hard push might have ended the war in weeks. But hesitation, timidity, and poor coordination intervened. Butler's subordinates skirmished cautiously rather than storming the works. By the time they realized how thinly the city was held, precious hours had passed. Reinforcements from Beauregard's army poured in, bolstering the defenses. What might have been an easy victory hardened into another deadly contest.
Hold this line.
On June 16th and 17th, Union reinforcements arrived, Hancock's 2nd Corps, Burnside's 9th, Warren's 5th, each corps hurled in turn against the growing Confederate line. The assaults were fierce but piecemeal, splintered by poor communication and exhaustion. On June 18th, Meade ordered a final general assault. The Union men advanced through choking dust and blistering sun, only to be met by a wall of fire. By day's end, the attacks had failed, leaving thousands of bodies scattered across the fields. Petersburg, so nearly taken, had slipped into stalemate. The soldiers felt the sting of lost opportunity most keenly. Veterans cursed Butler's name, calling him "bottled-up Butler" once more. They could see with their own eyes how thin the defenses had been on the 15th, how easily they might have broken through. Now, after 4 days of frontal assaults, the Confederates had transformed the city into a fortress. Fresh trenches stretched mile after mile, earthworks deepened, artillery emplacements bristled. What had begun as a chance for quick triumph had calcified into a siege. For Lee, it was both a relief and a nightmare. Petersburg held, for now, but only by the narrowest of margins. His men were exhausted, their numbers dwindling, and every reinforcement came at the expense of some other front. He had kept Richmond alive, but the price was a war that now promised no end except attrition. For Grant, the realization was cold and clear. The overland campaign, the series of bloody marches and collisions from the Rapidan to the James, had failed to destroy Lee in open battle. But it had accomplished something else. It had driven the Confederacy back into trenches, pinned it to railroads and fortified cities. Now the war would become a siege, a slow strangling. It was not the war he had wanted, but it was the war he was prepared to fight. In the Union camps, the soldiers dug in with weary resignation. They had fought through wilderness firestorms, through Spotsylvania's mud and blood, through North Anna's traps and Cold Harbor's slaughter. Now they faced something new, months of trench duty, constant sharpshooting, and grinding offensives for yards of ground. Many wrote home that Petersburg felt like the start of another war altogether, one that looked less like America's battlefields and more like something out of a nightmare, where men tunneled, burrowed, and killed from behind walls of dirt. The Siege of Petersburg had begun. For the Union, it was both a failure of opportunity and the beginning of the Confederacy's end. For the Confederacy, it was survival bought at the cost of being trapped in a tightening vice. The war had entered its final phase, though few on either side yet realized how long, and how bloody, that phase would be. As the dust of Petersburg's opening battle settled, the terrible arithmetic of the overland campaign began to reveal itself. From May to June 1864, the Union Army had hurled itself at Lee again and again, from the wilderness through Spotsylvania, North Anna, Cold Harbor, and finally to the gates of Petersburg. Each clash left the fields littered with dead, the streams choked with blood. Now, with both armies dug into trenches stretching for miles, it was time to count the butcher's bill.
Hold the line, men!
Grant's army had suffered between 38,000 and 65,000 casualties, depending on which records and which estimates were used, representing nearly half of his starting force. Whole brigades had melted away, their names remembered only on tattered flags carried back to Washington. Some regiments, once numbering 1,000 strong, now mustered barely 100 men. Yet the ranks were already being refilled. New recruits from the north poured in, heavy artillery regiments stripped from Washington's defenses had been converted into infantry, and the Federal Army swelled once more toward 120,000 men. Every soldier lost was, grimly, a soldier replaced. Lee's army, by contrast, suffered 20,000 to 40,000 casualties, smaller in number but devastating in proportion. His army shrank by nearly half, and replacements were almost non-existent. The Confederacy had no reservoir of manpower left to draw from, each fallen veteran was irreplaceable. To fill his ranks, Lee was forced to siphon men from other fronts, weakening the Confederacy's already fragile hold on its territory. His army stood at roughly 60,000, and even those numbers were sustained only by scraping together fragments from South Carolina, North Carolina, and the Shenandoah. Beyond the raw numbers, there was the hidden toll, the missing and the uncounted. In the wilderness, fires had consumed hundreds of bodies, leaving nothing but charred remains impossible to tally. At Spotsylvania, the trenches filled with mud and corpses, and many men simply vanished into the mire. Letters home described comrades who went forward in a charge and never returned, not found among the living, nor listed among the dead. Families waited for news that never came, their loved ones lost in the fog of war. The northern press seized on the figures with ferocity. Headlines thundered accusations against Grant, painting him as a butcher who spent men's lives like coin. The editorials argued that his strategy was nothing more than grinding attrition, throwing away human life in exchange for inches of ground. Lincoln, watching nervously as an election year loomed, felt the pressure keenly. His re-election seemed uncertain, threatened not only by the Confederacy's resilience but by his own citizens' exhaustion with war. Yet within the ranks, the view was more complicated. Soldiers grumbled about the losses, cursed the futile slaughter at Cold Harbor, but many also recognized the grim logic of Grant's persistence. Unlike McClellan or Hooker, he did not retreat after defeat.
Don't give up, man.
He always moved south, always pressed forward. For the veterans, that relentlessness carried its own kind of faith. They understood, perhaps better than the politicians, that the Confederacy could not sustain losses the way the Union could. The war was becoming a contest of endurance, and the Union had deeper lungs. In Richmond, the mood darkened. Casualties mounted, resources dwindled, and every telegram from the front seemed to bleed hope. Civilians buried their sons faster than they could carve gravestones. The once proud Army of Northern Virginia, though still formidable, no longer looked invincible. Whispers spread in taverns and parlors that the war could not be won, only prolonged. For the Confederacy's soldiers, the truth was plain. They were fighting with courage, but courage could not forge bullets, nor fill bellies, nor conjure reinforcements. They were asked to hold against a tide that never ceased to rise. For every gray uniform torn by shot, another blue coat appeared opposite, fresh-faced and well-supplied. It was a slow strangulation, and the noose was tightening. By the end of June 1864, both armies understood the new reality. The overland campaign had not produced a decisive battle, but it had shifted the war's balance irreversibly.
Charge now, boys. Push
Lee's
forward.
army was cornered, bleeding and shrinking. Grant's was bloodied but swelling, ready to fight another day, and another after that. The Confederacy could not win a war of attrition. But that was precisely the war it now faced. The overland campaign had cost nearly 100,000 lives in just 6 weeks.
South, for victory.
It was a butcher's ledger, a grim testament to endurance and sacrifice. And yet, as Grant looked south toward Petersburg, he knew it was not the end. It was only the threshold of something longer, darker, and more terrible, a siege that would stretch the Confederacy to its breaking point. By midsummer 1864, the story of the overland campaign had crystallized into a single truth: the Confederacy was being pressed into a corner it could not escape. For weeks, Lee had met Grant blow for blow, turning forests, rivers, and fields into slaughterhouses. He had checked the Union at the Wilderness, held grimly at Spotsylvania, foiled Grant at North Anna, and bloodied him horrifically at Cold Harbor. Yet at every turn, Grant had refused the old script. Where other Union generals had retreated north to reorganize, Grant simply shifted south, always south, dragging Lee into a relentless downward spiral. Now, at Petersburg, the spiral tightened into a noose.
Do not falter now.
Lee's army,
We are
once
so
the
close to
shield of the
victory.
Confederacy, crouched in trenches that stretched for nearly 30 miles, a serpentine wall of earth and timber around the city. His men were gaunt, their uniforms threadbare, their rations dwindling. The railroads that sustained Richmond and Petersburg became lifelines under constant threat, every trainload of food or ammunition a fragile thread in a fraying web. Lee had no illusions, he could not win a long war of attrition. But he had no choice except to fight it. For the Union soldiers, the siege marked a transformation. No longer would great battles decide the fate of campaigns in a few days of fury. Instead, the war dissolved into months of grinding trench duty, where sharpshooters' bullets claimed men daily and disease prowled the stagnant camps. Soldiers burrowed into the earth like moles, building dugouts, saps, and tunnels. The lines at Petersburg began to resemble what the world would later see in France in 1916 rather than America in 1864. For many veterans, this felt less like the war they had enlisted to fight and more like a descent into something unending and mechanical. Grant, however, remained resolute. He knew he had not destroyed Lee's army outright. But he had accomplished something just as valuable: he had pinned it. The Army of Northern Virginia was fixed in place, unable to maneuver, unable to strike northward, unable to relieve pressure elsewhere. Every day it stayed in the trenches, the Confederacy bled a little more. Every day the Union lines lengthened and tightened, new recruits and supplies filling the gaps. Grant's grim calculation was that the North could afford this war of exhaustion, and the South could not. Lee, surveying his men, recognized the same calculus with dread. His army was still formidable in spirit, but spirit could not replace powder or flesh. He knew his enemy's numbers swelled even as his own dwindled. He could fight, delay, even strike desperate counterblows, but he could not reverse the tide. His greatest fear had come to pass: the war had become a siege of attrition, and in such a contest, time itself was Union's ally and the Confederacy's executioner. In the trenches, the men on both sides whispered rumors of tunnels being dug beneath Confederate lines, of mines filled with powder, of assaults yet to come. The smell of decay hung constantly in the air. Letters home spoke of mud, lice, hunger, and an unshakable sense of doom. Some Union soldiers wrote bitterly that they had become diggers, not fighters. Confederate soldiers confided to their families that they were starving but still bound by duty to hold. Politically, the stakes soared. In Washington, Lincoln's re-election seemed ever more fragile under the weight of mounting casualties. Critics clamored for peace, branding the war hopeless, demanding negotiation. But Grant pressed on, convinced that each bloody week eroded the Confederacy's strength beyond repair. In Richmond, Jefferson Davis spoke defiantly of resistance, but privately he, too, saw the narrowing options. Thus ended the Overland Campaign, not with a decisive field victory, but with a grinding transition to siege. From the Rapidan to the James, from the smoke-choked wilderness to the blood-soaked trenches of Spotsylvania, from the failed trap at North Anna to the slaughter at Cold Harbor, Grant had driven Lee step by step until both armies were locked before Petersburg. It was not the war Grant had wanted, but it was the war that remained. And with that, the Confederacy's fate had been sealed. The end would not come swiftly, but it would come, carried not by a single thunderclap of victory, but by the slow, suffocating weight of attrition. The Army of Northern Virginia was trapped in its final act, and the walls were closing in. The Overland Campaign was over. The Siege of Petersburg had begun.